I also want here to take, before starting to ask questions to Ted, to take this opportunity to say thank you to the Carver Trust for all the support to make the Iowa Neuroscience Institute a reality. And without really their support, without the support of the Carver Trust trustee, without the support of Troy Ross, we will not have been able to achieve what we have achieved. Now, Ted, I have a few questions for you. The first question is, you had the chance to stay at the University of Pennsylvania or to go to other great places like Iowa. But why did you decide to come to Iowa? And so far, what have you enjoyed to be here?
So, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Jean, it's great to see you. Jean and I just realized that we now live kind of not so far from each other on either side of a woods out here north of Iowa City. It's really been a tremendous opportunity to come to Iowa. And as I was coming here in 2016 and getting to know everyone, I realized what an opportunity it would be for me. And it's been a chance to grow a community that was outstanding, and to make it even stronger and exceptional. The resources here are phenomenal, and primarily the resources are people. You've mentioned several as in your talk, and it's really quite a collaborative community that connects the bench to the bedside and to patients, and that's really what's made all the difference for us. And we've really been able to achieve a number of things in the last 3.5 years. And those include recruiting 18 faculty here that are in 11 different departments, both in the College of Medicine as well as in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And that's just been an extraordinary thing if you really think about that. It's like hiring a faculty member every couple of months. We've actually, among those 18, there are 5 who trained at Harvard University, which says something about what we're doing here in Iowa, which I think is really quite unique. And the uniqueness is connecting to the clinics. Where our labs are, for those fleet of foot, like the young assistant professors and postdocs, it's about a 6-minute walk from the neurosurgical suite to my lab to enable us to study tissue from human patients, for example. And so I've found everything I imagined, which was a collaborative community, but also a terrific place to live. Really, it's been a great place to come to the Midwest. I'm a East Coaster I was born in North Carolina, then lived most of my life outside of Philadelphia. And I'm wondering what I was doing struggling with the Schuylkill Expressway when I could be worrying about the little bit of traffic on Dubuque Street, of sort of, waiting for a traffic light for 5 lights or something. It's quite a difference.
Well, Ted, this is extraordinary to have been able to recruit 18 people in just a few years, and 5 from our farm club in Harvard. But how were you able to attract them here? What really attracted them to Iowa and to the Institute?
Well, a lot of it was the opportunity provided by funds that come from donors, funds that come from the College of Medicine. The College of Medicine has been very successful, actually continues to be successful even in the face of these challenges with COVID-19, with really a focus on investing in research and building world-class buildings that you are critically responsible for, Jean, the Papa John Biomedical Institute and the Papa John Research Building where we are is a world-class facility with magnets to do imaging in the basement, an animal facility, I think one of the world's most expensive ones, probably under this quad of lawn, but it's really tremendous. So the resources in terms of people, space, and then finances, and I see several people here who are individual donors to the Iowa Neuroscience Institute among the 130 or so, 140 now participants. And what everyone that has contributed has given us is really the freedom to follow our interests, our thoughts, our creativity. And what people don't always realize is that science and medicine is at the end creative. You get data from patients, you collect all these images of brains, and then you have to figure out what's wrong, what's actually happened to this patient, what is their diagnosis, how can we make life better for them. And I think realizing that part of medicine and part of science is being creative really teaches us something, that it's not just about cranking the handles. I think many people have realized that they have that opportunity to be creative here. Iowa is really a place where people grow up, where we really, and that's what's happened very much for the Neuroscience Institute.
Then Ted, can you share just briefly with all of us the impact that the Neuroscience Institute has already on the community, on the state, on the university, on the country? And you had a vision, you had goals when you came, and how are you achieving them?
So our impact comes in a couple of ways. I think one is extends even to education. We haven't really mentioned that yet. But with the departments of biology and psychological and brain sciences, led by Josh Weiner and Ryan Alumni, this neuroscience program was established when I came here, an undergraduate major in neuroscience, which had not previously been present at the University of Iowa. I believe there are approximately 250 students in that major now, and the first students have graduated, which has been really tremendous to give that opportunity to our Iowa undergraduates. We've increased funding in neuroscience at the University of Iowa from about $40 million in 2015 to the most recent figure I saw was $71 million. That's in extramural funding. That's every year we bring in that amount of money. And in addition to the $45 million that was a gift from the Carver Trust to found the Institute, we've raised over $30 million in other philanthropic sources from donors and foundations. So we've really been able to bring in a lot of resources, and we've been able to train a number of students. We've created a center, and one thing that's very interesting that's been developed with Peg Nopolis, who you mentioned, is an area called interventional psychiatry, which seems a little bit of an oxymoron. You think about psychiatry as a sort of lie on a couch and talk to somebody. But actually, Iowa has always been about the idea that psychiatry had to do with the brain. And George Winokur, a chair of the Department of Psychiatry some 50, 60 years ago, did the initial experiments and clinical studies that laid the groundwork for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is now in its 5th edition. And now we've developed tools. The most recent one is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, where literally for treatment-resistant depression, you can get stimulation using a magnetic field that stimulates the prefrontal cortex, and those of us with less hair are more effectively stimulated, I think. So there's some advantage to one's baldness. But we can use this transcranial magnetic stimulation to literally change mood. And so that's been pretty amazing to try to understand how this works clinically, how it works at the cellular and molecular level. And one of those recruits from Harvard University was Aaron Bowes, who actually grew up in Iowa and came back. And he came back to focus on this interventional psychiatry and transcranial magnetic stimulation. So we made a difference for patients as well.
Then Ted, I'm sure that people are quite interested to know a little bit about your own research in regard to sleep and memory, and what advances are coming, what are we doing for Alzheimer, and so on.
Yeah, so my own research focuses on the mechanisms of memory consolidation, and that builds on the idea that we don't just learn things in an instant. We actually continue to process information. Our brain continues to process information after an experience. And we found a number of ways in which memory can be consolidated and modulated at the molecular level and even at the behavioral level. One of those ways that memory is modified is through sleep. So we go through each night stages of sleep where we overtly look inactive, but we go through deep sleep, non-REM sleep, and also rapid eye movement sleep. And so our brain is experiencing over a night's sleep different patterns of electrical activity. And actually some of those patterns of electrical activity resemble the electrical activity that happens when we learn. So if we study animals, which is what we do, we study rodents. When an animal is exploring an environment, its neurons in its brain are firing in a certain frequency as it explores. The other time that neurons fire in that frequency is during REM sleep. And so quite literally, we have replay happening during sleep, replay at the cellular level and at the molecular level. And we've been able to characterize that. And the interesting thing, I think the striking conceptual thing, is that over a night's sleep, actually, the connections between our neurons change. And they change over the day, and then they're modified and restored over a night's sleep. And if we lose sleep, which we do experimentally in animals, we sleep deprive them, that causes the brain to lose connections between neurons. And that's part of why sleep deprivation has its dramatic effects. And those effects include, we think, and a number of researchers think, that sleep loss lays the groundwork for neurodegenerative disease, and that it's really alterations in middle age that lead to severe cognitive impairments and dementia in older age. That's explicitly true for Parkinson's disease, where Parkinson's disease is seen, a precursor of Parkinson's disease, is seen in what's called REM behavior disorder that happens in middle age. And individuals with alterations in REM sleep and with restless leg syndrome, where you are moving your body during REM sleep, they can later be predisposed to developing Parkinson's disease. So the really challenging thing about psychological and neurological conditions, psychiatric conditions, is that they have their origins decades before we see them. So Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease have their origins in our 30s and 40s. Autism has its origin in development, in utero and in very early development before we might diagnose someone. And so our challenge is to find markers like blood pressure, which for the field of stroke and heart disease is a critical marker that tells a doctor to keep an eye on a patient because of their high blood pressure, and also argues to reduce and treat those markers of future disease. So in neuroscience, we're trying to find those markers and hope that that will enable us to develop better treatment. And some of that's come from our studies of memory and how memory is altered. Another thing that is very interesting, we were having a discussion with a number of faculty at a faculty senate retreat yesterday, and trying to think about how to help students learn better in the face of virtual instruction and COVID-19. And one of the things that we discussed was really turned out neuroscience of memory, and that was that students need to retrieve information. They, if we just do a thing where you have a course where you just have a big exam at the end, students don't learn as well. They learn much better if they have shorter, more frequent exams and quizzes. And that's literally because part of how we remember is by retrieving our memories. And then that helps us stabilize them. And so there's some aspects of neuroscience that can tell us not just about how to treat disease, but also about how to improve education, even in the face of all of these new virtual modalities that we're now facing.
Now, Ted, just a practical question. People, when we get older, we losing some memory. When are we supposed to get concerned about this? Are they concerned? The second thing is, I think, the second question related to that, I think a few months ago in Nature Medicine, people have suggested that simple blood tests can distinguish Alzheimer's from other neurodegenerative disease. Is it a blood test that will be available to people soon, or is it still under investigation? If it was, it will be great because people want to have to go through lumbar puncture or PET scan and so on and so forth.
Right. So let me start with the second one first, which is the blood test. I think clearly all parts of the body are related, and there are symptoms that show up peripherally of what's happening in our brain. We can actually see that if you look at motor symptoms. Obviously, there are overt ways to diagnose disease that don't necessarily involve brain imaging. I don't think we're quite to the level of having a blood test that would be sensitive and specific enough for Alzheimer's disease. I think there may be tests that would point that there may be problems, but not necessarily to give the specific diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, but to make someone pay attention and see a neurologist, a cognitive neurologist, to get appropriate testing. Now, in terms of when we should worry about memory loss and how we should respond, I guess I would say two things. The first is that our brain is a fragile organ. I mean, we see that in concussion and other forms of injury. We see that in developing depression in response to stress. And I think we always need to be focused on our brain function, the way we're focused on measuring our weight and our blood pressure, as my doctor has me do frequently. And we don't always think about the brain that way as something we should sort of measure. And so, you know, keeping up where things are, having a sense of how you are, both in terms of your emotional well-being and also your cognitive well-being, I think is always very important. So my mom is now living with us here. She's 84 years old, and I think our measure of her cognitive ability is her performance on the New York Times crossword puzzles. I don't know if my mom Annie has joined us, but that continues to outpace me. We were in a doctor's waiting room on Monday, and she was outpacing me on my iPhone doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. So I think there are ways to kind of quote unquote probe your cognition, and it's not a bad idea to keep them up. But one broader thing and bigger thing, and that is that the brain is about plasticity. The fundamental thing in neuroscience that distinguishes our field from other fields is that, many other fields, is that the brain is a use-dependent organism. It does better the more you use it, and it always has a reserve in many ways. There are billions of neurons, each of which make tens of thousands synaptic connections. I always jokingly say to people, you're welcome to go into my brain and take a neuron, but just take one. You know, leave the rest, the other ones will pick it up, right? And so this thing about plasticity is important because it means even in old age, even when we're having some trouble with aspects of cognition, we still have some parts of plasticity. We have other forms of cognition that are intact. We've done some experiments in mouse models for the study of Alzheimer's disease. We have animals with severe burden of this thing called tau, these tangles that occur with Alzheimer's disease. They have memory deficits, but if we treat them with certain drugs, we can enhance their memory. So they're still able to improve their memory, even when they have severe cognitive deficits. And I think that is the encouraging thing. That's the encouraging thing about neurological disorders. It's also the encouraging thing about neurodevelopmental disorders. Our son, Seamus, is 20 years old. He's starting as a freshman next week at the University of Iowa, taking what he thinks is a light course load of German, math, and chemistry. I think others might, it's light to him because it avoids English literature and writing, but it's not a trivial course load, and he's on the autism spectrum. And he's benefited from in his life is some phenomenal physicians and clinicians, a phenomenal mother, a phenomenal grandmother who have helped him develop, helped him be plastic, helped him learn how to navigate the world. And so that plasticity is a hallmark of the nervous system. And it's an opportunity for all of us to develop and develop new treatments based on that plasticity.
Then, Ted, you talked briefly about depression or about psychiatric disease before, and obviously this is a condition that affects over 16 million adults every year in this country. You mentioned transcranial stimulation has a way to help the people with severe depression. What about the new treatment with ketamine? And how's this ketamine working? And now there is also ketamine as a nasal spray.
Yes.
And, how do you, is it a new way really? Is it something that will help people with severe depression and eliminate electroshock and so on?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I think absolutely, and we're administering that at the University of Iowa. There's one of our hires, Mark Nishu, who came from NIMH, Mark was in the lab of Carlos Zarate, where they did some of the really seminal clinical studies showing the effects of ketamine. Ketamine actually comes from the study of synaptic plasticity. So in the 80s and 90s, people were studying ketamine, modifying these receptors called NMDA receptors, right at the very heart of this synaptic plasticity I was talking about. It took 25 years for that to turn into a clinical treatment, but it came from the lab bench, actually not from the lab bench, but from the electrophysiology rig, but it's still a lab bench, so experimental. And so that is very promising. The nasal spray is tremendous because it previously was only IV, which is quite challenging. What's interesting about ketamine and interesting about many treatments is, we know that ketamine has an effect on a specific receptor, but when it's given to a human patient, it has more of an acute effect and also a chronic effect. And we don't actually understand the mechanism of that chronic effect. I was actually talking with a collaborator at Vanderbilt yesterday. Her name's Lisa Monteggia. We may do some experiments with her because we think that some of the things we know about memory and the molecular mechanisms of memory might be the mechanisms by which ketamine has a long effect. And so we may start helping with some of those experiments. But what's interesting about these new treatments, firstly, those represent the first new mechanisms to target for depression for decades, like for 50 decades, ketamine does. It's pretty amazing. So we are getting new treatments for psychiatric disease and neurological disease. But there's actually even a bigger challenge, I think, than treatment. And that challenge is a challenge of awareness and acceptance. We changed that with cancer. With a realizing that we could get early diagnosis and treatment of cancer, and a lot of that was awareness and advances. But if people weren't aware that they could be treated, then they wouldn't have been diagnosed. And with neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and neurological conditions like Alzheimer's, we really need to expand our awareness and our acceptance of these conditions, and that will help enable treatment, critically enable treatment.
Now, Ted, few questions. One more question probably before we give a chance to our friend in the audience to ask you a question. Eric Kandel, who you work with, and in addition to winning the Nobel Prize, is very much interested in the arts. And when you read one of his books about this, he tried to differentiate work of art, work of music, and so on and so forth, is how our brain function, or how the brain of different people who have different skill function to explain why people are so good in music, so good in painting, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the expertise is a really interesting phenomenon, as you pointed out, and I actually think art and science have more in common than we realize. I think there's a regularity to the science where we have to learn all these rules and then be creative within those rules. Music, I think, is similar. I actually play the clarinet, and I've actually used the quarantine to learn the saxophone, which has been an interesting form of plasticity. But clearly what you're doing when you do art or creative arts, you're really using aspects of your brain. For example, with sculpture, the spatial navigation system, your ability in spatial awareness is all something that is a distinct forms. At Iowa, we have an interesting program that's out of the Bell and Blank Center that is thinking about exceptionality and about giftedness. And there you have individuals in the Bell and Blank Center who come to college in high school. So Iowa is one of the people where we've really built a program. Susan Asseline is the director of that Bell and Blank Center. And one of the things that is medically challenging is that a number of those individuals that are talented also have, in addition to their talent, other challenges, psychiatric challenges. attention deficit disorder, autism, other disorders that are challenging for them and hold them back. And one of the things that I think is important in this acceptance and awareness that I was talking about is being aware that exceptionality has its challenges. And one thing, you can see that how can we enable our artists or writers to really perform and do better. One thing we see in Iowa City is we see that creativity. I miss that with COVID-19. I missed the Friday night concerts downstairs, the downtown, the jazz festival, and the readings at Prairie Lights. And so the arts, I think, I think they're more connected to the sciences than people lead on. Certainly Eric Kandel himself, his fundamental talent is as an artist. He is creative. I mean, what I learned from working with Eric was how to think about a problem creatively and how to write. He's a phenomenal writer. His undergraduate degree from Harvard is in history and literature. It's not in chemistry or physics. And he went on to medical school, but his undergraduate degree is in history and literature. And it's that thinking, that creative thinking, that is what enabled him to make such a mark on science.
Well, Ted, I think we have few questions coming from our audience. I will leave Tony to.
I was creative by being an opera singer.
Hold on,
Hello?
Dr. Robillard, we've got somebody that's not muted. If you can mute yourselves, please.
Yes, I will. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, I don't think it was you. Great, well, very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Robillard, and thank you, Dr. Abel. This has really been fascinating. We've had a few questions come in for you, if you'll take a few moments to answer them. Has there been any research in regards to sleep and those that suffer from PTSD?
Yeah, so the question is about the relationship between sleep and PTSD. Yes, there's been a number of studies that have been carried out, and it's actually very interesting connecting PTSD selectively to REM sleep. REM sleep is one of the is a stage of sleep in which we dream. It's where typically dreams are attributed to REM sleep. It's also a kind of sleep when over the night, we first go into non-REM sleep. So when we first go to sleep, we go into deep sleep. And then over the night, we have more and more REM sleep as part of our sleep time. And REM sleep is also part of what enables us, we think, to wake up. It's a kind of sleep that is a little bit lighter, a little closer to wakefulness. But in PTSD, there's been specifically some correlation of alterations in REM sleep. And some of that has been connected to a brain region called the amygdala. The amygdala is a brain region that was studied by many, but studied in a particularly exciting way by the Damasios here at the University of Iowa, who studied a patient with a genetic lesion. And so she did not have an amygdala and was not able to experience fear. And so the amygdala is part of what gets activated when we are afraid, and it's part of what drives fearfulness. And so you can imagine its connection to PTSD. It turns out it's also connected to REM sleep and regulating REM sleep. So if there are ways, one of the other things about sleep that I didn't really talk about directly is that if we can find ways to normalize sleep patterns, we may be able to improve outcomes for patients in many ways, because obviously we all know that if we don't have a good night's sleep, we're not quite right that next day. But that's happening every night of every day for individuals with insomnia or REM behavior disorder or other disorders. So it's important to find ways to normalize that.
Is there any research going on at the Institute around epilepsy?
Yes, we have a tremendous program led by our chair of neurology, George Richardson. Whoever asked that question, thank you very much. I should have mentioned epilepsy before now. Thank you, question, whoever asked that. Yeah, so George Richardson, who's chair of neurology, has a group of researchers that study epilepsy, and in particular, they focus on a form of epilepsy and a phenomenon called SUDEP, which is sudden death from epilepsy. And in some cases that gets attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, but it's really a seizure. And they've done some very interesting and important experiments to understand the circuits that mediate that death by seizures. And it looks like that's because sometimes seizures stop breathing. And particularly seizures, interestingly enough, the question's very well timed, because it's seizures in the amygdala. It's like someone wrote these questions. They're a great pair of questions. It's like, so it's seizures in the amygdala that under certain circumstances can cause breathing to stop. And that is literally a cause of literally sudden instant death. And George Richardson leads a center to study that. And he's had a preference for recruiting from Yale University, but that's okay too. We'll go with that. It doesn't, everyone doesn't have to be from the other place. And there's a number of epileptologists, one of them, Gordon Buchanan, who are working in that field. So absolutely.
So we have a couple of questions about students and sort of next generation. How important are grad students in your work, and what advice do you have for those that want to go into the neuroscience world?
So the students and research fellows are everything. They're to me, they're the most important impact we can have on the field, is training our students. I don't know if Jean knows this. He doesn't know this probably. But the one thing that gave me the most pause in leaving the University of Pennsylvania was that down the hall from me at Penn was an assistant professor named Elizabeth Heller, and she was an assistant professor of pharmacology. Liz Heller was one of the first undergraduates to work in my lab. She started working in my lab when she was 17 years old, and she desperately needed black and white cookies sent from New York from her mom to get her through the day. And now Liz is a professor at Penn. And she went and did a PhD at Rockefeller and a postdoc at Mount Sinai. And to have her down the hall from me was really, I mean, to say it was priceless, it really was priceless. And she was one of the first people I went to talk to when I decided I was leaving. I didn't go to the dean first or my department chair first. I went to one of my old students first to tell her that I was always happy to help in any way that I can. So really, the students are the creative engine of what we do. And I think it's really important. For the students that are thinking about going into neuroscience, I think a couple of things. The first thing I think is to find mentors. You really need mentors. Mentors make critical difference in your education and your field. It's not about this course or that technique or this place. It's about this person and this environment and the difference they can make. The other thing which is interesting, I think, is learn how to learn. You think I might say, learn neuroscience. I actually never took a course in neuroscience in my life. I've taught them and written papers about them and etc. But really learn how to think creatively and learn how to write, because that will serve you well in all of your whatever field you wind up in, certainly neuroscience.
Very good. It looks like we do have some students on the call, so I'm sure that's some great free advice for them. We've got time for just a couple more here. What do you think, or what do you hope to be the most significant breakthrough from the Institute to take place in the next few years?
If I knew that, we would. So I'll make a guess. I'll tell you some of the things that I think we're doing that I think are very interesting. So we, with the support of the Carver Trust, we recently established a neurobank, and that neurobank is a core that is a bank, a brain bank. But we didn't call it a brain bank because we're also collecting tissue that can be used to make neurons. We can now make neurons in a dish from pieces of skin. And we're also using that core to develop sort of digital neuropathology studies. And the reason why that's important is I think we're beginning to realize, so if you think about neuroscience, we have a patient, and neuroscience conditions, you have a patient, that patient appears with symptoms, and then typically they get a brain image, MRI or PET scan, and we try to understand with the clinical impression what's wrong with them. But what I think is missing from many of these things is the cellular and molecular perspective. So I think what we're going to bring to bear in the next few years is analyses at the single cell level, where we can analyze gene expression of individual cells, and we can even do that in a slice of tissue. So we can take a slice of tissue and analyze gene expression on that slice of tissue. And that's critically important in the brain because the brain is all about location and complex connectivity. And so there's a name that's bouncing around here, a wonky name of a field. That name is molecular systems neuroscience. And that is the idea of bringing molecules and cells to the images that we see when we see MRI imaging of the brain and PET imaging of the brain. And so I think that's one of the places we're headed. That's a novel direction. It's a direction that requires a lot of computational expertise in deep learning and artificial intelligence and machine learning, an area that's been called computational psychiatry. But connecting the properties of individual cells to brain function is where I think would be a very interesting frontier that we're aiming for.
That's incredible. And, you know, we started this series when we kind of went on lockdown and quarantine. And since we've had so many faculty and alumni that are on the front lines of research, curing disease. We had a COVID expert. We've had artists that have made us laugh and played music for us. But there's always kind of been this general theme that the country sort of has PTSD. And I'm getting several questions here. Do you have any advice for us to all get a good night's sleep every night?
So one piece of advice, I guess there are two pieces of advice. One is to really, the main thing is to have a contrast in your day, right? And that's actually generally a challenge here. I mean, I'm in my office at home and maybe I go out to get a cup of tea or I'm back in my office, or, you know, we really need to have more variation in what we do. So what's important is to be more active when you're active and more rested when you're restful. And so that means that if we can be more active in terms of getting some exercise, and then when we go to the room we sleep in, don't go there with all of our electronic devices. Don't go there with a 55-inch TV on the screen while you're trying to sleep. Go there to sleep. And so having this separation of spaces in which we are active and functional and spaces in which we are resting, I think is one of the, the phrase is sleep hygiene, which seems like a funny phrase, but it's not. It makes all the difference in the world. But the other part of sleep hygiene is being active during the day. So walking, biking, finding ways to be physically active will help you as you sleep. I think the other thing is we need is a little bit of patience here. We're all trying to do things that we've never done before, that we have no idea what we're doing. I mean, our son's trying to navigate a freshman year of college virtually, and, you know, we don't know what we're doing. He doesn't know what he's doing. We're all just trying. And so I think this concept of patience, while it sounds kind of obvious, is important. The other thing that's important is this, when we think about this awareness and acceptance, I mean, we've been looking very much, when you think about what's happening with COVID-19, it's like people are scared of a single bug. I mean, it's a terrible disease, but exposure is about levels of exposure and modifying your behavior so you reduce your exposure level. You can't avoid the world. You know, and so that's one thing that I think physicians know, okay, I'm going to put this mask on, I'm going to put this face shield on, and I'm going to stay distance from people. And I can function. I can still make people better. I can still treat them. And my mom has been seeing some physicians here at Iowa who are just extraordinary. And so they're wearing masks, they have a face shield on, but their eyes, they are just focused on her and on treating her. And they're completely present. And so that it's just been, so I think a lot of it is we need to be more flexible, more patient, and more present. I bet you that's not what you expect to hear from the Neuroscience Institute director, but that's a big piece of it all.